Welcome back, friends, to In Our Skin. Today, we are talking about the thing that everyone asks me about and that I often find myself asking myself about, which is how do we get out of these feelings? How do we get out of these states of mind and body that we might find ourselves stuck in and we might feel pretty helpless to? So, know that there is hope. I'm going to talk to you about emotional granularity, what it is, and how it provides potential for not only feeling better mentally, physically, and emotionally, but has been researched to show that it improves our resilience, our ability to cope, and our overall well being. So, I'm really excited to share this and some really fun stuff within that, as well as how to start to pick up on patterns that we might not have been noticing. And the things we don't notice, we can't change. So I'm hoping that this allows you to leave with something in your back pocket that you can start to pay attention to and you can start to put into action. If you listen through to the end, you're going to get steps to do just that. And today we're going to talk about it in a way that I'm really excited about. So we're going to talk about that age-old trio of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and the ways in which they're interrelated. And while we're talking about trios, I have to know, did you see in the headlines about the throuple, where 1/3 is a ghost? I realize that this is slightly off topic, but I just have to share the things that make me smile. And I have to tell you, this one really did. Now note that I am not judging this throuple. I am all for ghost stories. If you've ever met me, and maybe this is something you don't know about me, I really am quite into ghosts. Never been this into ghosts. They have an image that they shared of him, and he looks like he's straight out of a Sarah J. Maas series. So I'm really happy for them. Congratulations to all three. And if you have a good ghost story, please share it with me. I love to hear this stuff. I hope you do too. But I digress. Let's get started. So today we're going to talk about the ways in which we might overattach to our thoughts and our feelings without meaning to, and the ways in which we might actually oversimplify our experience. While this does not mean that I want us to get ourselves more entrenched in our thoughts and feelings, the kind of oversimplification that we're talking about, I think you will understand by the end of this conversation. And so we will get a little more clear, a little more direct, a little more granular, and a lot less attached to the patterns of thought and feeling that we might find ourselves frequently stuck in. One of the things that you may or may not recognize in your life is that you have a set of emotional experiences and patterns that you are more likely to experience, say, than your best friend or your partner or your boss. And then if you step back and you consider what kind of patterns you see in them, you might see that they live more frequently in particular states, right? So we all might be prone to different dispositions. That's pretty typical, right? And if you think about it, we are in a way talking about personality. One definition of personality from Britannica was that personality is how we think, feel, and our behavior. So the combination of those three things makes up our personality. Now that might be an oversimplified definition of personality, but I think that it's relevant to what we're talking about today. The way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we behave is the way that we show up in the world. It is the person that we're bringing forth. But this is the thing, that can change. Now, you might love your personality. You might love the way you're thinking, feeling, and behaving right now, and that's fantastic. For most of us, for most people I meet, there is something in the way that they are thinking, the patterns of thought they find themselves caught up in, the ways that they're feeling that maybe they want to be able to manage differently. And the behavior that comes of those two things, if they are not what you want them to be, also tends to be behavior you don't want. So if we want any of these things to change, we can really change any of those things. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of change, let's take a moment to just understand where we're at as human beings and the way we're showing up today. We are living today based on conditioning of our past. In any given moment, our past experiences are informing what our brain is predicting is going to happen in this moment, and it's informing how we'll respond and behave and the actions it will take in this moment. Now, if you're not quite with me on this, let's go a little further. Historically, there was a classical view of emotions in which it was believed that human beings across cultures had the same set of emotions, and the expressions that went with them were also fitting and cross-cultural. And what we know now from thousands of studies is that it's actually not true. There isn't even a place in our brain or our body or a system for emotion. Emotions are the combinations of the signals and the physical sensations, and they get combined with the narrative in our mind of what our experience means. and then they get stored. So we have a fund of constructs in our mind that our brain can reference in the moment so that when something similar happens, we can easily access. Our brain knows what is not only happening, but is predicting what's happening next. So let's pause for a moment and answer the question of what is a construct? A construct is a mental framework. It's a combination of thought, feeling, attitude, and belief, and these come from our past experiences. So let me give you an example of a construct. Imagine walking through the woods. In the trees up above, you hear the leaves rustle, and from the corner of your eye, you can see movement in the branches up above, and it's something that is black. Now, my construct would suggest that this is a snake and that it might fall out of the tree, because I have, in fact, been walking under a tree and had a snake fall from the branches above my head onto the ground. Now, my mental construct doesn't just come from snake in the trees. It could be the sound I heard in the branches up above. The fact that it was something up above me also registers, right? All of those different signals and sensations. My breathing changing as I hold my breath and tense my body, and I feel fear. Now, the feeling of fear, we'll talk about feelings in a moment. That's the word that I put to this emotional experience. All of those different details of what's happening in my body and in my mind. So in this scenario, there is a filing box in my mind, and I label it fear. I'm afraid. So now let's say that someone else is walking through the woods. When they hear the sound up above, they might feel joy. Their body is compelling them to move quickly, grab their binoculars, and look up because they are a birder and they are excited to see what is in the trees. So two people can have very different emotional experiences in the same setting, right? We're going to have different responses. Mine based on my past experience. That person based on maybe the intention or what they believe or expecting to find on that walk through the woods as they are literally looking for birds and trees. And this is what happens. Now, it's not always about snakes. We might have different responses to seeing someone roll their eyes. So someone who grew up with a family member who often rolled their eyes at them. Now, this person might have associated that eye rolling with a meaning, right? A belief of what this person believes of them or that they now believe of themselves, and a set of responses within their body. One person might activate, one person might shut down, we might deactivate, and we're going to have the feelings that go with that experience. So let's take this same person who has grown up with someone rolling their eyes at them in a way that they're interpreting as belittling, and they say something that their friend interprets as silly. And the friend rolls her eyes at the thing that they are interpreting as silly. Well, when you see that person roll their eyes, if you have the past experience, that construct in your mind is what is going to be triggered by your brain because it's familiar. Our brain is just simply looking for what is familiar to know what to do next. So when someone rolls their eyes, we go into our familiar response. Now, as a kid, that response, the next action, might have been to react, retaliate, call them a name. Or it might have been to cry and retreat to our room. So in the present day, it will be highly likely that we will respond similarly, even though the person in front of us might not be a person who is in a pattern of belittling us or putting us down or expressing annoyance at us. This person might be loving, and they might think that what we said, again, was simply silly. And so they were giving us their body language response for something that they thought was silly, but we will react based on our past experience, not the present moment, not the present person, before we mean to. So again, this is automatic, and our brain is brilliant. So while this might seem dysfunctional, and sometimes it is, it serves a purpose. It keeps us, again, moving efficiently through our life and our world and navigating for safety and comfort in just the way that our nervous system would want us to. But when we notice patterns like these, we do have the power over adjusting the way that we respond to the feelings as we begin to recognize our patterns. So our brains, though brilliant, are kind of living in the dark. Literally, they're inside our head. Our brain cannot see what is real and happening in this moment, so it can only assess based on the information that is sent from the sensations and the signals within our body. So our body is gathering information constantly as we move through the world. And if you haven't listened to the episode on our nervous system, go back and listen to that, because if you combine the information from these, so much of your experience will make more sense. This information is gathered and sent to our brain, and our brain is making sense of these signals and our state of being in that moment. The pang in your gut, your brain has to make sense of it. Your heart fluttering, your brain makes sense of it. Our brain relies on these constructs that we have, these conglomerates of our experience from the past, to help us determine what to do in the moment to move forward, how to respond to the sensation that is felt. So the brain has constructs that we have constructed, and it uses it to construct our experience. Now, this isn't bad. Can it be problematic? Sure. Can it be very functional? Absolutely. But here's the thing. If my past social relationships were rife with problematic patterning, I might bring that experience into my present. Actually, I can tell you, I guarantee you will have, at some point at least, brought that experience into your present. Does not mean we cannot change and correct it. But let's say that there were people who were unreliable or untrustworthy or inconsistent. Your brain is more likely to predict, based on someone else's behavior in the present, that an inconsistency or unreliability will present itself again. And so the actions that it will have you take will likely be self-protective. Now, the person in the present might actually not be demonstrating behavior or sending signals that are truly in line with that, but they might have done something that's familiar from the past. Does this feel true? Does this feel possible that this could be happening in your life? I think so. For most of us, we might be reacting now to something that isn't present with a friend or a partner, maybe that was even present with them in the past. It's hard for human beings, as we all know, to forgive and to trust after things have been difficult, after there's been some kind of breach of trust, right? So we probably have seen and felt this play out. There might be a part of us saying, I want to be able to show up differently. And we might have this inner conflict where it's hard and our brain is automatically signaling for us to self-protect. What is happening is that the brain is using our constructs formed from our past experience to predict the future, which is actually our present. The brain is working so quickly to keep us moving, to keep us safe, to keep us alive, just to keep us functioning, that it's having to make decisions based on these signals, these pieces of information that are coming through moment to moment to determine if we move our right arm or if we stop and freeze. Our brain has to decide. So it's kind of mind-blowing. It works. In most cases, this works, right? It keeps us going. It keeps us functioning. And yet sometimes it's not the best. Meaning it's not the best we can do. It might not be the most accurate. And so we're going to talk about how we can take this amazing, efficient process that is happening in our mind and our body and tweak it so that it works a little better for us where we are in the actual present today, so that we can teach our brain how to predict more accurately based on what's happening in our life now, not so much what has happened in our past. And why do I care about this? And why do I care about you caring about this? It's because if these emotions aren't hardwired, if these constructs have been wired, we can rewire. It means that we have the opportunity to change a lot of our emotions, our feelings, and our responses to what's happening in our world today. So much like we talked about in the nervous system episode, we actually do have more power and more control than we might think over our emotional experience, our experience of feelings. And if we harness this, we're able to feel a little differently as we move through our day. It might be helpful to consider that we have an experiential self, the version of us that is present in the moment having an experience, and a narrative self, or many other selves, that are telling the story of our experience. Now, sometimes even when we are in this present moment, we're in our mind in experiences that have happened earlier that day or earlier that week or earlier in our life, or we're in our mind and we're thinking about the next thing that's going to happen. So we are not even always in our present moment experience. And this isn't something to judge ourselves for. It is very easy for human beings to be pulled by thought. We are not weak. We are pulled there. We're compelled into our thoughts. You've likely heard me say this before, and I will say it again, that we repeat 90% of the thoughts that we had yesterday, today, and the same will be true of tomorrow. And these repeating thoughts are likely to be the things that we are identifying as the problems, the challenges, the threats. Now, our mind is holding on to those because it wants us to solve. It wants us to get out from underneath those discomforts. And because it's seeing them as a threat and problem, it's keeping them front of mind. The information that is more neutral and positive isn't given as much weight and importance in our mind because it is just that. It is neutral to positive. The things that are seen as problems needs our attention. And so we are often in this moment, and the thoughts about the thing that will happen next that we haven't yet figured out how we're going to navigate, that perhaps we have fear, reserve, hesitation, anxiety, frustration, agitation, hopelessness, or helplessness around. Or it's thinking about the things that do not yet feel resolved that have already happened, because those will stay with us and they will still feel like threats and problems, because what they're doing is they're getting attached likely to our identity in some way, shape, or form. That's likely a separate conversation, but we might get there today. So in this moment, that version of us that would be experiencing this moment is often pulled out of this moment. And one of the best and easiest ways to actually get clear on if our emotional state is in line with the present or the past is to practice pausing in neutral moments to look back. So I might have been pulled a moment ago in the woods by the thought that something in the trees was a snake. Come to find out it was a branch. My body might still be activated in a way because of that 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later. Even when I'm safe, even when I'm fine, and even when I know that wasn't a snake, I actually might be more likely to jump at every sound I hear as I move forward, assuming now that everything is a snake, right? So if I can get myself into the present moment, if I can get myself into that experiencing self mentality, I can look back and I can actually acknowledge what were all of the feelings that resulted from that emotional experience. This is really helpful. And this sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But we don't always do this because we don't really recognize what is happening in our mind and body all the time. We just keep going. There's more to do, right? So when we practice these moments of just pausing and looking back and without judgment, saying, what was I feeling? Now, I might have felt like I was going to die. I probably felt helpless, defenseless, like I had no control, no power. I probably felt scared. I probably felt threatened. Okay, so there's a handful of feelings that I would have in that scenario. Without actually looking at those feelings, and by the way, those feelings probably seem very obvious now that I have named them, I just move forward, and here's the kicker. Still feeling those feelings. But if I do slow down and I go, okay, I felt threatened. Do I feel safe right now? Do I actually feel threatened? Do I truly believe that the risk of a snake falling out of the tree is so high that I'm going to be on alert or not want to walk under a tree? As I'm saying this, anyone with a snake thing is like, don't walk under the trees. But if I actually look at what I'm feeling, I usually can determine what I need to do for myself to actually resolve, to actually cope with those feelings so that they don't carry forward into the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, hours, days, weeks. Sometimes things stay with us for a long time. So this is a really functional, very practical thing that we can do, but we don't often slow down and do it. And so I'm saying it even though it is obvious, and making this a practice actually can take a little bit more than you might think. Because if I ask you all how you're feeling, you might not actually have words for it. Even looking back on the experience with the snake or your experience that was hard earlier this morning with your boss or your partner or your child, can you actually put words to the feelings? Now, we'll often be able to recognize that we had an emotional experience. There was a rise or a fall. There was an intensity of sorts, whether in your breath or your heart or your gut. But can you put words to it? There is this thing called emotional granularity that is used to describe our ability to actually tease out our feelings from our emotional experiences. There will be people who are at one end of the spectrum where it might be good, bad. okay, not okay, pleasant, unpleasant. At the other end of the spectrum is a wide vocabulary for how we're feeling. Now, you've probably heard me talk about expanding the words around what you're feeling and that it can be beneficial. And here's why. Because it actually increases our resilience as human beings. It's associated with improved ability to cope and overall well-being. So I say we can't lose. I don't think we can lose on this one. If we can start to expand, and I'm going to help you do this by giving you some new words today, then I think that it is fair that we can hope that we might be able to manage difficult experiences differently. Because we can't regulate what we don't recognize. We can't take care of a feeling that we haven't identified having. And then if we can put a more specific word to the experience, we have an even better chance of being able to not only manage it differently today, but potentially to rewrite the construct in our mind for our ability to manage it or how we want to respond to it. So we're going to bring this all back together at the end. Let's look at this now. We've talked about our emotions and we're talking about feelings and definitions around each of these very widely. Scientists cannot seem to agree, but I want us to have working definitions so that you understand both pieces of this experience for yourself as you move forward. So here's what might be helpful to imagine. That emotion is the orchestra of sensation in your mind and body, all the sensory experiences combined. So while our emotions start as sensations, our feelings are generated by our thoughts about the emotions. So our feelings are the labels that we put to those emotional experiences. It's those feelings, therefore, that are determining for our mind and body what's a greater threat, what we can cope with, what we can't. Those words can mean a lot to us, our mind and our body, about what we do next. And what we do next is very interesting based on the different feelings that we have. So for example, one of my clients was talking about the list of things that had been weighing on her this week, and the combination, the conglomeration of all of it was really leading to nothing getting done or getting resolved. So when we broke it down and looked at what was on her mind that maybe she hadn't been completely aware of, just talking it out loud helped her get so clear about what was there. Then we looked at, how do you feel about all of those things? And the feelings were feelings that we all probably have in the span of a day or a week. Frustrated, nervous, scared, and then helpless and defeated. Defeated really jumps out. And here's why defeated jumps out. If we already feel that we have been defeated in something that is on our mind that we believe that we need to do, what's the result? If I feel that I'm already defeated, that word has a lot of power over my response. I'm defeated. Therefore, I can't do anything. If I do anything, and if I do something, it's not going to be for a beneficial outcome, it's defeat. Now let's look at the other word, helpless. What is the action that's going to come when our brain interprets helplessness? Is it going to be action and motivation? Is it going to be drive? No. Our brain and body are assessing that there's literally nothing that we can do to get out from underneath this. This, I hope you're seeing, is really interesting, and I hope you see why. If we have certain feelings, we have beliefs about what we can and can't do to resolve them, to cope with them, to move forward. And if we don't identify that that's the feeling that's there, we stay still and nothing changes. Now, in this example, this person actually has really good emotional granularity, meaning those are some pretty diverse words to explain the experience. It's not just I feel bad or good or pleasant or unpleasant. They actually had words for the experience. Now let's look at why that's important. Had that same person said, I have this laundry list of things in my head that I didn't realize were playing, and I feel crappy. Now, that would be accurate. They might say, and I feel anxious. And that would be accurate too. These are not wrong or bad answers. But when you break it down to helpless and defeated, you now actually have information about where there is something that you can address and shift. This one starts in thinking. We have to start by recognizing What is the effect of defeated? Why do I feel defeated? Where does that come from? Because I can tell you that where helpless and defeated came up for this person, they were actually things they were very capable of doing. There was a lot of possibility. They actually realized they weren't helpless. They had not yet been defeated. The fear of defeat and failure, pretty high for a lot of us. So these things might come up for us in the back of our mind without us recognizing all the time. And if we say anxious, we don't recognize that. And if we say crappy, we don't recognize it either. So working on expanding those words is super valuable. And in the moment, most of us are not going to be able to do that kind of expansion, but we can do it in retrospect. So again, I was saying, we live in our narrative mind a lot of the day, repeating thoughts. But if we practice those moments of pause where we're like, why do I feel this way right now? What was the beginning of my day like? What was my state of mind like? What was I feeling physically and emotionally? What were the actual feelings that I was experiencing in that scenario where I walked away feeling so heavy, so down? What were the feelings? What are the feelings I'm feeling right now? Even if they aren't hard ones, practicing both ends of the spectrum actually is equally beneficial. So I'm going to continue to offer you all access to the feelings wheel that's within my Change Your Relationship with Food program. For those of us who actually don't like clicking through to find these things, I thought we'd actually spend a little time looking at what are these words for feelings and how far can we expand them? And we're also going to dip a little into other languages, which I find fascinating. I have to tell you that I did go on a bit of a deep dive while I was doing this because I've had a lot of conversations lately with my clients about how other cultures have such good words for states of being that we just lack in the English vocabulary. And so I reached out to my multilingual friends from different countries, and we got responses from Gaelic to Hindi, Lebanese to Polish and Czech, and so many between. I took to the internet because I have to tell you, German has so many amazing words that we do not have. And when you have conversations with people about language, you will hear this all the time. That in one language, we don't have a word for something that another language has, and that another language has so many words to describe one thing that we have one word for. So this was pretty fun, and I highly recommend that you do a deep dive yourself because you will find some great new words. Now, because I am not multilingual, I could not pronounce half of these words, and I am not going to butcher them and disrespect these languages here, but I will tell you a few of the great ones. I'm going to have to continually look down at my phone for all of these answers that I got from people, but there are some gems. In Korean, there is a word for the feeling you have when you're in a stuffy room and you need fresh air. And there is also a word that describes not just the ambiance of a place, but the feelings and emotions that you have with the place and the people in it. The BBC has a great article that is about the untranslatable emotions of different languages. And here I found some great ones. The Portuguese have a word that describes shedding your inhibitions and having fun. Whereas in Arabic, they have a word for that feeling of ecstasy and enchantment you get specifically from music. In Japanese, there is a word that is specific to the relaxation that you gain from bathing in the forest. And I absolutely love this one. There is an Inuit word that describes the anticipation that you feel when you're waiting for someone, so much so that you just keep going and checking outside. I love that. Don't you love that one? There is a Hungarian word that literally means with a relaxed brain, and it describes quick-witted people who come up with sophisticated jokes and solutions easily. And the Sanskrit word sukha can be translated to genuine lasting happiness despite circumstances. German has so many amazing words, but two were shared with me, one being the specific pleasure that we have in the misfortune of others, and the other, perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, a feeling of warmth and friendliness. And it might surprise you to know that the Eskimos don't have a word or concept of anger, and the Tahitians don't have a word or concept of sadness. One source expanded that when Tahitians feel what we might describe as sadness, they might instead report feeling fatigued, unenthusiastic, or even ill. One thing that I thought was really cool that I wanted to leave you all with was that the Irish describe feelings and emotions differently. For example, you don't say, I am sad. Instead, you say, there's an emotion on me. So there is a sadness on me. And I think that this is magnificent because what does this do? It gives us an automatic degree of separation between who we are and what we are feeling in this moment. And in this way, it reminds us that our emotions are fleeting. They aren't who we are. And so we might not get so deeply entrenched in them that we can't see them clearly or see ourselves despite them. And because I did not give you actual words that I could pronounce, I'm going to give you some from English now. So let's look at this together for a moment. Now, anxiety is something that I think is great that we are able to recognize, because I can tell you when I started doing this work out of my master's degree, very few people came in describing anxiety well. And now even children can describe anxiety. But let's see if we can turn that into more of an umbrella term and start to get more granular about the different versions of anxiety. So under the umbrella of anxiety, we have scared, fearful, or we could have insecure, rejected, feeling weak or nervous, feeling threatened or terrified or inadequate, inferior or worried or excluded, alienated, vulnerable, worthless, panicked, or uneasy. Now, I will tell you that on this wheel, the word overwhelmed is here. And with the people that I work with, I make that one an umbrella, or I want to cross it off altogether, because overwhelmed certainly is a powerful descriptor. But when you ask people, they can often break it down into more specific words. And to me, overwhelm is synonymous with I'm feeling a lot of different feelings. Another of the main words that we use is anger. And now anger has a lot of variation, whether or not we recognize it. So I want to help you all recognize what words you actually might relate to more and feel more frequently than angry. Do you feel offended, agitated, aggressive, frustrated, hateful, mad? Do you feel let down, humiliated, skeptical, insulted, provoked, hostile, annoyed, violated, resentful, furious, betrayed, disrespected? Do you feel bitter, unheard, ridiculed, or embarrassed? You will find that some of these words can overlap into other categories of feeling that you might put somewhere else and not under that angry umbrella. And that's perfect, because these don't need to fit under any umbrellas. The beauty of emotion is that your experience of anger and mine are going to be completely different. The way I feel in my body in response to something that triggers what I label as that feeling is going to be completely different than it is for yours. And your response thereafter is going to be completely different than mine. Let's go next to sadness or depression, which is another word, much like anxiety, that we hear people express often, and see if we can expand and find some new words that might be better fitting for you. Do you feel lonely, guilty, tired, hurt? Do you feel left out, forgotten, abandoned? Do you feel ashamed or powerless? Do you feel grief? And grief can be its own umbrella, and it can include anger and frustration and sadness, right? So again, we can continue to expand on these for ourselves. Now, I told you we could also benefit from getting granular about the joyful feelings and the happy feelings, so let's look at some of those. Do you feel optimistic, fulfilled, energized? Do you feel excited or hopeful or thankful? Do you feel loving, enthusiastic, accepted, or proud? That's a lot of feelings, people. And remember, you really can make it up. I actually have clients who do this. When they are looking at how they feel, they will put their own word to the experience that they frequently have that words don't really fit. And when we do this, we're actually creating a construct. We're saying to our mind and body that when I experience this state of emotion, this is what I'm feeling. And our brain starts to recognize that and take whatever action it is we take when we feel that way. So when we start mindfully choosing the actions that we take in response to states of mind and body, our brain learns it. Our brain does rewire. And this is where change begins to happen. It is in the literal act of putting words to our experience that we start to take back control, and we start to remind ourselves where our choices are. When we are in our feelings, when we are having an emotional experience, if we don't do that layer of work of identifying what it is we're feeling and experiencing for ourselves, then we miss the opportunity to choose what to do with it. When we start to name difficult feelings, even if they are difficult feelings, We're starting to identify what it is that we actually need to manage, what we need to cope with. We are giving ourselves information to work with. And so we can look at a different angle of why using these words, this emotional granularity, can help us and our mind and body in moments that are hard. While we can't choose for our heart rate to go up or down, we do have power and control over the way that we assess and label our experience. If we catch the moments of defeat and helplessness and we put different words to it, like fear and challenge, now we have a jumping off point. Now we have this functional ability to start to face the challenge, to start to choose what to do about the fear so that we can manage our state. This means that we're giving our brain new information to tap into, and it can help prevent our brain from predicting the worst case scenario, and it can help our brain access the stores that say, we know how to manage this one. So what's an example of this? Let's take the word anger, for example. Anger actually might be enough of a differentiation from other felt states for someone to have enough granularity to get the benefits. But let's take it a step further and let's look at the ways in which someone might have been using the word anger, but that could describe them in different ways, different states that actually can inform different ways of coping and self-regulation. So let's look at the way in which someone might describe the way that they felt when they were doing certain things as the word anger, and then let's see if we can expand it. Let's imagine someone noticing a pattern of angrily cleaning. In another moment, they notice a pattern where they feel angry and they find themselves eating compulsively. In another, they find themselves angrily stewing, thinking repeatedly about a problem with a partner in their head. Okay, so in that first example, where they're cleaning and they're feeling angry, a word that might better describe it is agitation. I can potentially do something different if I notice agitation in my body, and that might lead to more words. Maybe they're feeling frustrated. Maybe they're feeling helpless or unable, and so they're cleaning, right? If I'm noticing agitation in my body, I might go, oh, if I'm agitated, what can I do? And maybe it's a body-based practice for regulation. Cleaning might be actually keeping someone in fight-flight type of activation. So doing something opposite could bring it down. So now let's look at that example of compulsively eating and describing that as a feeling of anger and instead parse it out. This person might actually feel jaded. They might have felt slighted. They might have felt disrespected. And those words tell them something different. What does it tell you? This is interpersonal. Something happened with them and another person. Now, that does give us information about choice, power, and control. Those words tell them that there's something that they're not okay with. And this might be something they choose to communicate with the person, or they might choose not to communicate with the person. But now they've identified that these are the feelings. And we get to choose which feelings we stay in, we hold on to, or which feelings we want to move through. When it comes to anger and the stewing pattern, what they might notice is that it's actually resentment. And resentment, once we notice it, is something that gives us a lot of information about what we need to do. Often these are the things that we're holding on to that we're not expressing, we're not sharing with the other person, and therefore they're not going to change if we keep them in our head. Now, this could get complicated, and we are going to have a whole episode on resentment soon, but this gives us a different kind of information than angry. When we see that we're resentful, it gives us more information about the narrative in our head, the story around it. It might inform us of where this actually came from past experience and not our present partner. So these words can give us a lot more than just labels. If we don't practice things like this, we might actually be leaving our mind and body in a state of, I don't know what to do. And that is what a lot of us feel so often. When we don't do this, we might actually be walking around thinking that we don't know what to do to take care of ourselves or to cope or to manage or to feel better. I think we've all probably had moments like this. And in those moments, we've gone on autopilot. This is where people go into patterns of self-soothing and coping that they might not want to find themselves in, and they might not understand why they're going there. So if we start to look at, what was I feeling back here before I did the thing? What was I feeling really? Can I break it down? And what would I do differently in response to that feeling if I was flexing my power and choice? And you start to practice that, you start to give your brain a new pathway for choice and for operating and for automating. And the research supports this stuff. Those who are more emotionally granular, and it does not mean having the best and biggest vocabulary in the world, just being slightly more expanded than those polarities, these people are less likely to drink, less likely to become violent, less likely to get sick, and more likely to find ways to repair relationships. And as we've discussed, the less granular we are, the more likely it is that our brain will continue to overgeneralize and just repeat behavior. Now, that's not always bad. Sometimes it's really working in our favor. It makes life easy. But when something is showing up that you do not like, that you're having a hard time with, this would be a really good skill to practice. We can get granular to get even more effective. We can get granular to get more efficient, and we can get granular to have a higher level of functioning and less distress. Now, here's the other thing that this granularity does. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett gives this analogy that I think is really helpful for us as we are thinking about all of this emotion and feeling and our body and our brain, and what do we do with it? I want you to think of your body through the lens of her analogy, that your body has a budget. Like a bank, your body can take in energy like savings and it can expend it. And you only have so much in any given day. Now, your brain alone takes 20% of that budget. 20% of the energy that you take in during a day goes to your brain's functioning. Now, there are things that are mentally, physically, and emotionally taxing. And in this scenario, I want you to literally think of them like you're being taxed. They are taking from your budget. Some of the things that are taking from our budget are our own emotional responses to the world around us. Now, if we are having an emotional response that is out of line with this moment, or if we're repeatedly having emotional responses and feelings that we don't know how to cope with or manage, we are spending from that budget every day in ways that we might be able to actually retain and save and create more efficiency and energy and savings for that bank. So while some things tax us, other things we know they give. They give us energy. They make deposits in that bank. So when you get a moment to relax, or when you're with people you love, or when you do something that helps you release some of the stress that you have been feeling, you are making deposits. When you're experiencing stress and it's not checked or managed, you are being taxed. So our brain has to coordinate all of the systems in our body and manage this budget to the best of its ability. So it has to budget. Body regulation is its job. But let's say that we have something approaching. Maybe it's a big presentation or a test. I want you to think about those types of things as taking withdrawals, because that means that the brain is in anticipation mode. It knows that something is coming, and we go into that preparation. Our body is gearing up. While we previously would have called this anxiety, perhaps, I hope now you are calling it something like determination and courage and readiness. And I hope that what you're doing is you're thinking about how you can make some deposits when you're making those withdrawals. So to help our brain and help our body regulate, we can make deposits. We can make deposits like water and food. We can put something in savings the night before by going to bed a little bit earlier, right? There are things that we can do to better our ability to manage emotion beyond those labels. If we think about our body and our brain in this way, then we can recognize that there are simply going to be moments when we are low on funds, where we do not have a lot of energy in the bank. In those moments, what we know both scientifically and realistically from our own experiences is that it's not only harder to regulate, it's harder to access certain emotional states. When our body is low in energy, low in funds, it is harder to maintain certain states, and you will find it more likely that your body will tend toward other emotional states when funds are low. This is a really important thing to recognize. When I was saying earlier that we all might tend toward a few certain states day to day, you might have one for when your brain and body are low in energy, low in funds. And by being able to recognize that in advance, it can really help us do that Irish thing of separating from what we're feeling and our state of mind and body to say, this is on me. This is what is present because I'm out of resources. It can be a really great way to neutralize, to be able to remind ourselves that we might simply be out of resources, that this might not actually be the state of our life, but the state of our body and our mind when we're depleted. It's really important. Remember how I was saying earlier, we have this experiencing self and a narrative self? Well, in a moment like this, your experiential self is in a state of depletion. So it's not always our narrative self that is problematic. At times, what is present in the moment is actually truly, factually challenging. It can feel like being out of funds, out of resources, and that gives a lot of fodder to our narrative mind. What if we now layer on an experience like we talked about earlier? Someone rolls their eyes at us. When we are already depleted, our resources are low, we have no funds in the bank, and something happens like this. I think we all know that our emotional response is going to be affected by how able we are to self-regulate. When we're looking at this fund of resources in our banks, when we are depleted, when funds are low, our ability to self-regulate, that means to ride out our emotions, to cope with our emotions, to get ourselves from the initial emotional experience, the feelings, the dysregulation to a state of groundedness, once again, is a lot harder. So there will be moments within our day where we are more vulnerable. Now, I'm talking about this like it's the end of the day all the time, but that's not always the case. If we haven't slept well the night before, we don't have anything in the savings bank, or we're starting out with depleted funds. So we might find the vulnerability occurring earlier in the day. We might also run into days, moments, and periods of time in life where we are especially taxed by losses, life adjustments, and profound experiences that bring us to depletion. In those moments, it is going to be harder for us to regulate our emotions, to get ourselves to calm, to grounded, to neutral, to feel good again, to feel relief after hard emotional experiences. So when we do that practice of pausing and getting into the moment, getting into that experiencing self, and what we are experiencing is depletion, what do? Unlike moments in the day where we have a greater fund of resources for coping and adjustment and self-regulation, in this type of state, we don't have access to those resources. And so we have to do the next best thing for ourselves. This might look like simply naming to the people around us that we are depleted. This might simply look like naming for ourselves and the people who are around us that this is the state that we are in and that we are depleted. It might look like having tea instead of the glass of wine. It might look like going to bed early instead of staying up later. When we are in these states of depletion, the best thing we can do is not something that is going to take further, that is not something that is going to take from us further, is not something that is going to rob us of that savings of getting the rest that we need to be able to wake up and start over the next day. Now, this is very easily said. This is much more difficult to do because we have constructs in our mind that are likely built around these feelings at the end of the day and patterns of action and behavior that are tied to them. So I want you to start to notice that wow, that I might actually have this whole sequence of behaviors and patterns at the end of the day when things are harder that I fall into because I wasn't recognizing how I was feeling and that I was depleted and that I wasn't able to do anything else. But this is when people are highly likely to have patterns of self-soothing or reactivity that don't actually feel aligned with who they are. So notice, don't judge. No, it's not easy to actually change those patterns, but that it is possible. And that if you start to break it down into small steps, do one thing that is a little bit better for you, that gets you back to feeling like yourself just a little bit more, or that puts a deposit rather than making a withdrawal, then you are starting to make change. All right, so let's recap. What are we going to do with all of this information? We are going to begin to first pause occasionally to look back on our felt states to see if we can get a little more granular about how we have been truly feeling. And if we're lucky, we might be able to name how we are feeling in this very moment. Though doing this in retrospect is where I recommend starting because in the moment of a feeling, it is really hard to see clearly. Next, we're going to start to expand our emotional vocabulary so that we can get more granular, which will help us deconstruct those old constructs that aren't working for us. Remember, You do not have to be aware of every construct in your mind. They are not all doing harm. This is only about those patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that you find yourself in that don't feel aligned with the present and that are not working for you today. So we're going to take those so that we can begin to deconstruct those constructs, expanding the possibility of our emotional experience and our felt experience so that we can acknowledge where we have choice, power, and control to self-regulate more effectively, to care for ourselves more effectively, to motivate and direct our energy and attention in the ways that we really want. If you listen long enough, or if you have worked with me, you'll know that one of the things that you'll learn is that coping skills can be rather universal, and we don't need a different skill for every feeling. But what you'll notice when you do this is that you'll no longer find yourself continually coping with the same patterns of feeling and actions and behaviors in your life. The more clear we can get on why we're doing what we're doing, why we're feeling what we're feeling, the more likely it is we can actually change it so we don't find ourselves in those felt patterns over and over again. It allows us to make choices and changes in our life that prevent us from having to continually cope with difficult states that are repeating. And finally, we're going to pay attention to our body budget. We're going to pay attention to all the work that our brain and body are doing to move us through our day, to recognize when our resources are depleted, when coping is harder, and when it makes sense so that we can acknowledge that for ourselves instead of over-identifying with those felt states that can be rather hard. Being depleted puts us all in a certain state of being that isn't necessarily our best self. So remember that it's not you, it's you depleted. And those funds will restore themselves over time. But think about those things that you can be doing that are putting deposits in the bank. Thank you all so much for being here, for listening along. When you look in the show notes, you're going to find links to my free coping skills course for those of you who are scared you don't know how you're coping and you need something. You'll again find a link to the feelings wheel so that you can start to practice expanding your emotional vocabulary and get a little more granular. And we're coming up on retreat season, friends. So if you're interested in a real live experience, get on the wait list. Let me know you're interested, and you'll be the first to know when the dates and spaces are released. And remember to subscribe, follow along, and please rate and review. It helps other people find this resource, and I am eternally grateful for your time. This is In Our Skin. Thank you for being here. Until next week, take good care.